Hi, my name is Mai'a Williams. I am currently in Minnesota, Minnesota, United States, in a small rural town on Lakota land, and indigenous Lakota land. Um, and so that's where I am at the moment. The quarantine happened in March and I was here. So it was like playing, the game musical chairs, where you're just sort of going around in the quarantine and you're like, oh, okay, this is me. So that's where I've been for almost a year now. It wasn't my plan, and I'm literally in my bed because I have a tiny room that I usually operate from. So
Nice.
it's also noon here. Um, so that just gives sort of some idea of where I am
Real
in the
time.
universe. Okay. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about my background. I am a writer and editor who's worked primarily on issues around gender and migration, and community building, especially in the Middle East and North Africa. Like that's my bread and butter. I lived in the Middle East for about 7 years, mainly in Palestine, in the West Bank, and then in Egypt. And I was in Egypt from 2009 to 2014. So before, if you guys remember or knew about the Arab Spring, I was there before, during, and after the Arab Spring, which is having its 10-year anniversary really soon. So that makes me feel old, I'll be honest. That's 10 years. I also worked, and there I worked for various news outlets as a journalist. Probably the ones you've heard of are things like Al Jazeera, as well as a lot of local grassroots-based organizations doing work around migration. And I worked primarily always with women because that's how it works out. I also worked as a journalist for Telesur, which is based in Venezuela, for the Venezuelan government. And after that, I'm going really quickly because it's a lot of history. After that, I worked with a social justice organization called The Body Is Not an Apology, it's much more about like US based politics and like Western based politics, even though it claims to be a global organization. That's how it goes. And currently, I am living in Minnesota. For those of you who heard about the uprising that happened in Minneapolis in the summer, in late May, early June. So I work with an organization in Minneapolis that does uh, community health responses to both COVID and the uprising against the murder of George Floyd. Okay, so that just sort of gives you just an overview as well as I still am an editor on the side. So that's just sort of gives you an overview of where I'm coming from. I lived also in Berlin for off and on from, I mean, my visa ran out a couple of months ago, but I was officially living in Berlin when COVID happened, ironically. Hey, I do plan to get back when my country decides to get a social public health policy that is not horrendous. But I'm not allowed to leave the country at the moment because I have cooties. It turns out that's really what this is about. Okay, so that's me in a really quick nutshell. If you have any questions, if you have any questions, put them in the chat, or just like you can even like raise your hand. I will see it. I think if I put the view on correctly, I can. There we go. One last thing, which is that I am a native English speaker. And I was born and raised in DC, went to school in New York. So my tendency is to speak quickly. And I have not lived outside of the US for a year. This is the longest I've lived in the US since 2001. So I know that my normal voice for not speaking to native English speakers has weakened because I just haven't had to do it. So again, if I'm speaking too fast or I start using words or whatever that don't translate well outside of Minnesota, again, please just tell me to slow down. It's totally fine. I've had to learn way too many languages, second, third, and fourth language, to ever make anyone feel anything but grateful for telling me to slow down, check my language, and stop using so much slang. So just please, just note me on that. Since we're gonna be talking about writing and for social change, I should at least start with myself. All right, so what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna do a really short reading. And then I'm gonna kind of talk about my viewpoint as from being an editor and from being someone who's done a lot of writing in this realm, and like what to look for and what to think about and how to coordinate it in your head, especially, yeah, and then we can kind of open it up as well. Does that work for everybody? I'm just gonna assume yes. Okay, cool. Oh, last thing. If you want to turn off your monitor, that's totally okay. I actually hate having mine on, having to listen to someone else talk. Like, you don't have to give me the visual feedback. You're here. I know that. You can go like pet your dog or whatever. I'm not. Okay. So we're gonna start off. So in late 2018, I didn't publish it. PM Press published a book that I wrote. That's how it usually works. Oh, I wrote a few books in the meantime. The last one is called This Is How We Survive. See, show and tell. This Is How We Survive, Revolutionary Mothering, War, and Exile in the 21st Century. It's a long title. We can put the title in the chat later on. So I'm gonna read a short excerpt from this just to sort of warm up my voice, because this is happening about 2 hours quicker than I had in my head thought it was. So the coffee's super fresh. All right, so let's do this. I wrote the pages down. I'm really proud of last night Mai'a, who wrote down notes and got everything ready, feeling super prepared for today. Last night Mai'a was amazing. 1 second, let me just turn off my phone because it's my job is being. All right, so basically this is describing on January 25, 2011, so almost 10 years ago, I was living in Cairo, Egypt, when the Egyptian uprising started. And we were living on Tahrir, which is the main square on which a lot of things happen. We were living on that Tahrir street. And so I basically just describe a bit from January 25 itself. That's just to kind of give some context. So at the time I was living with my daughter and my daughter's father, who was my partner. Okay. On January 25, 2011, Cal, my partner, and Aza, my daughter, returned from their walk down Tahrir Street to watch the protest on Police Day. Riot cops and black trucks lined the streets leading to Tahrir Square and the demonstrations against the police. I was editing an article on my laptop in my rose and gold bedroom, birds of paradise dried in a vase on my spray painted vanity. Guess what? Okay, let's skip through that for a second. 2 years after arriving in Cairo, we lived in a 3-bedroom apartment in the Do'i neighborhood on Tahrir Street across the Nile River from downtown. Cal taught at an English elementary school and was studying at the American University of Cairo. Usually I was home by myself in the mornings, writing and editing, but since it was a police day, Cal and Aza, along with the rest of the country, were on holiday. Cairo. When we first arrived, I marveled at the overflowing third world city like Addis Ababa, where Cal and I had visited for 3 weeks. Cairo, full of African people from Sudan and Ethiopia and Nigeria, full of Arab folks from Palestine and Iraq, Saudi Arabia and Lebanon, and Europeans and North Americans and Australians, the streets packed with folks selling everything: sunglasses, flip-flops, brightly colored polyester hijabs, scarves and dresses, cigarettes and cell phones cases, pocket flashlights and knockoff pocketbooks, plastic cups and plastic figurines, old cars that spurt clouds onto the sidewalk, traffic lights that were just a suggestion, hours-long Thursday night traffic jams on bridges over the Nile River, motorbikes coasting between planted cars, and that Egyptian dialect, so unlike Palestinian Arabic, No, this was a city talked so quick that the tongue ran over itself trying to tell a story pregnant with off-color jokes, wet wit, malaise, religious devotion, and Belle Epoque songs. In the Middle East, Beirut was the second Paris, but Cairo was the city of vice. Young men smoking hashish and drinking cheap liquor in darkened city corners and hoping for a better life in this great African city that their Egyptian schools had told them was pharaonic, not African. But this city was twice as populous as New York City, full of immigrants, like Arab Egyptians who had escaped their towns and villages to come to the great city and make or risk their fortune. Afro Egyptians whose families had lived in this land for millennia but still were asked, "Where are you from?" originally by Arab Egyptians who didn't want to believe that they were African, full of refugees just trying to survive day by day in a country that treated them like roaches or demons, wondering when they'd finally go home and stop making all this trouble. Full of Bedouins from the Sinai who were being occupied by one nation state or another, England, France, Israel, Egypt. "We are not Egyptians," they'd say in their deep guttural dialect, waving their hands through the air as if brushing away a persistent mosquito. Full of university students and beggars, full of prostitutes and gay boys, full of lovers finding small places, dark corners to feel love without the pressures of family or mosque edicts. Cairo, where folks talked politics by way of jokes because it was illegal to speak the truth about political prisoners and police states, about a dystopian present and how insecure a secure state can make you feel. And now, on police day, it had all blown up. The kids had gone to Tahrir and gotten arrested, and then had gone back to Tahrir again and again and again, insisting on bread, freedom, and dignity, insisting on their own version of paradise. Okay, so that's the intro to January 25, 2011. And so for the next 2.5 weeks, people protested in the thousands and millions, um, refusing to allow for, excuse me, the 30s, I think he was 30-year dictator, 32-year dictator, Mubarak, to remain in office. I realize now there's a deep irony about the fact that so many people did so much to get rid of a dictator and then 2 years later installed another dictator who is now still in office. Yes. So for those of you who may know something about current Egyptian politics, so that's the beginning. So that's the first day. So I'm gonna read a short portion from the day when Mubarak was kicked out of office, and then we're going to go into talking about writing. How did I do this? Okay. Okay, here we go. So this is the moment when we find out that Mubarak has agreed to leave office. I really need to turn off the tones on my computer. I have a job that's 24 hours, that you have to get things 24 hours, and sometimes I'm like, okay. All right. So we were in a taxi on the way to downtown to go to one of the protests when the traffic stops and the radio turns on, interrupts the Kulthum music, which is ubiquitous in Egypt, and announces 3 times that Mubarak will step down from office. All right. This one, I feel like this is, let's do a little bit of this and then I'll be done. And then the overwhelming roar of car horns screeched down the streets. People started running, shouting, "Horeya, Horeya," waving flags, pumping their fists in the air. The streets and sidewalks quickly filled with dozens and dozens of people, crowds of young folks and parents and children and musicians, the pure sound of celebration and alarm. This was it. This was the moment I had been waiting for, not just for the past 18 days of demonstrations or the 2 years of living in Cairo, but for the past 31 years of my life. The moment when I got to see the people win a revolution. All the sacrifices, the deaths, the imprisonments, the murders, the revolutionaries dying in the streets, all of it was for this moment. Was it worth it? I don't know. But that wasn't the question really. The question was, would we take this moment and make the most of it? Um, we stayed for a couple of hours, reveling in the merriment, and then we headed home, pushing through the throngs of people who were still pouring into the square. I was in love with everything. At our apartment, I saw online the whole world celebrating with us. Around midnight, a friend texted me, and we were meeting downtown at a cafe, buying beers, and then heading to a houseboat. Going to a houseboat is a normal thing to do when you live on the Nile. It's just the way, it's a much more comfortable way to live. Um, okay. We walked towards the Nile, sharing beers and smoking cigarettes in the streets. In the houseboat, the lights were low and umber inside the living room, the speaker system blasting Arab and Western pop music. We talked fast. Friends of mine went to unchain the houseboat from the dock and set it sail down the Nile. Tonight, they said, anything is possible. We were giddy off the power of having pushed history forward. We told old and new stories of folks getting arrested, getting shot at, making out, dancing, singing, chanting, laughing, fighting, and winning. We won. It only took 2.5 weeks, 18 days, and we had ended a 32-year-old dictatorship in the largest city in the Arab and African worlds. Okay, I'm gonna end it there because I think that might be a good final point. It's like normally when I give talks, I don't end on a really high point. So I'm trying to like learn to be more positive. So we're gonna transition from there, and I'm gonna talk a little bit. I'm gonna go through. I wrote things down. So what I want to really talk about is writing, because that's my jam. That's what I do, and I write obviously primarily in English, but I spend a lot of my time writing and being an editor in English for people who English was not their first language, because I worked primarily outside of the US and outside of the UK. And I want to talk about how we become comfortable with our personal voice and where are the lines and limits around that. And then we're going to move into what to look for when we are preparing to write about the visual documentaries that we are presenting, right? Because words normally have to accompany such things. So we'll do it in 2 parts. And the first part is just like about writing itself. Okay. So as I said before, like one is that I have a different again, if you have questions or anything, raise your hand. But I want to make this really clear. I have a really different view, I think, about writing English as an editor and as someone who's done book editing and done like journalism and just done editing for almost across the board than most of your teachers probably did about writing. So that's the first thing I want to sort of take back for a second. I also had to teach English when I was in Cairo to women who were refugees into Cairo. And I think this is because I did that kind of work. I think that's where I developed that as sort of different praxis around it. So, and I developed this out because, to be perfectly honest, I speak English as my first language. It's the easiest tongue for me. And because of that, I think I felt a little bit guilty going to places and teaching English. Does that make sense? It feels like a colonial exercise. It doesn't feel like a colonial exercise. It is a colonial exercise, okay? It just is. Like, so many layers of horrific colonization that go into telling people that the language they grew up with is not a language that will ever get them, that they have to learn a completely other language. And that language is not Esperanto. It's not even Spanish, which at least is logical. It is one of the most illogical languages I think that has ever been conceived. I read somewhere that someone said that English is like 3 languages in a trench coat claiming to be one. And I think that, it's a ridiculous language. So I feel, so it's like a double sense of like, I can't believe I have to tell you, you have to learn a language where nothing makes sense inside of it. It's this labyrinthine. So the first thing I realized when I was teaching creative writing to folks is that everybody has their own natural English. Like everybody, like language, your English is like a fingerprint, right? Like no 2 people have the same Englishes. And that sort of opens up the door to what you're able to feel like you're comfortable to say. I read those two pieces for a couple of reasons. One of them is because neither one of them is in grammatical English. If you look at them on the page, neither of them follow perfect grammar structure that we were taught in English. I use a lot of cuts, like cuts in the sense of like not every sentence has a subject and a predicate, like a noun and then a verb and da da da. I use a lot of description, and I use periods and ways in which we're taught that we're not allowed to do so. But I believe very strongly that if people can read it and understand it, then it's good. The purpose of language is to communicate, and if you got your point across, then you said it correctly. That's the baseline for me is that. And I say the same thing in writing as well. Okay, so the first thing is you don't have to have perfect English to write. The second thing is, I'll say this. I am obviously from the US, but my grandparents come from South Carolina and Louisiana, which is still in the US. I understand that does not sound as, but I will say that both my grandparents, my grandmother who grew up speaking in Louisiana in the Bayou, so she spoke Creole as her first language, which is if you don't know it, it's like a mix of French and a little bit of Spanish and some English, and there's some Africanisms in there too, and it's all in a mix in Louisiana with a very strong Southern accent. I currently live in Minnesota, which is in basically Canada, and I can tell you that 95% of the people would not have been able to understand my grandmother, right? Lived the whole life in the US. Most of the people who speak standard American English could not have understood her. The same thing goes for my other grandmother who grew up in South Carolina, barely traveled, lived in rural South Carolina her whole life, spoke with a very strong Southern accent. And again, I understood her fine, great storyteller, the reason I became a writer. But most people who speak standard American English could not have understood her either. So this is my other background in terms of why I think English is like a fingerprint. Like, so if you can write it and people can understand it, halas, like it's done. And the last thing I'll say about that, this is just sort of confidence builder before we get to tips, is that what I was making a joke with a friend of mine, and we were saying how most people spend 12 years in school and then, I don't know, another 4 years in college learning like correct grammatical standard English. And then they go and get an MFA, like a master's in creative writing. And then they spend another, in the US, we spend money for this, $40,000 to $80,000 to unlearn all of that, to find their natural voice again. And it's just like this really ridiculous system where you spend most of your time getting your master's trying to learn how to unlearn all the writing you learned for the first 16 years of your life. And so she and I are like on this like new thing where we're like, we're gonna teach people in high school to write as they speak, and to learn how to write that down and communicate it well, you know, rather than, it's important to be able to make a grammatical sentence, but when telling a story, that's not how most people tell stories. So it's an odd way to deliver it. Do you know what I mean? And it also leads to like, have you ever read something, a description of I have, and it's so dull. It's so utterly dull. And it's usually dull because all of the spice and flavor of how you got that story has been taken out so that you sound a certain type of like way. A lot of academic writing has that quality attached to it. So if we want to tell stories that make people want to pay attention, we oftentimes want to use the energy that we had when we got the story. That voice is the voice that normally conveys it a lot better. All right, so that's my personal philosophy on English, which you probably did not expect to get today. Okay. So that's the first thing. So that's just the basics. So I say a lot of that. I say the same thing, by the way, to like I have a 13-year-old daughter, and I say the same thing to her. So I'm not giving you any advice that I would not give my own child whose success I am dedicated to. All right, so I want to talk about some tips for learning to find that voice. The best way that I figured out how to do it, and that's why I brought show and tell, is because So when I teach writing workshops, I normally use Natalie Goldberg and her work, which came out in the 80s. I know, but I really love this book and it's really, really good. It's called Writing Down the Bones. This is probably my third copy of this book. And it has a series of exercises. She's written a bunch of them, but these are the two that I love. She's written more updated versions of things, but I'm a traditionalist, I guess. And this one's called Wild Mind. And both of these are books, especially this one. It's kind of well known in the writing teacher, creative nonfiction universe. It's like a classic. And it has a bunch of exercises in it as well. And so but I started reading these. I think this may have been the first writing book I ever read. And I think I may have been 16 when I read it. I'm 41 now, just to give you this is my third copy. So that should tell you how dedicated I am to this one. I have written most of my books that I wrote. When I wrote a book, I would come back to this book and go through it again because it's so good at finding that real story, finding that real voice, the actual texture that you want to tell a story. So there's that. So yeah, and so normally what I do is I just if I like when the elections were the US elections, this wild thing that I just lived through, when they were happening and we were doing writing responses to it, the first thing I do is I sit down with a piece of paper. Also, by the way, if you're having issues, get a piece of paper and a pen and write by hand, by the way, because that will help a lot. I think the laptops often, it changes the way the voice comes out. And I just write straight for 30 minutes, 10 minutes. I set a timer or an alarm and I just start writing and I try to record the voice that's actually happening in my head, the exact way that it's coming out onto the piece of paper, which is in part why I use a pen and paper, because it slows you down so that you can actually hear the voice that's in your head and then you can write it down. And I don't cross anything out. I don't erase. I don't edit. And that's really hard for me as an editor, by the way. That is like, it's why it's a practice. It's like, it feels like meditation. Like I have to like put myself down, like, and be like, you are doing this now. Or else I will do the thing I want to do, which is cross out and make that sentence better. Because a lot of the times what we think of as better just means less raw, less interesting, less personal, less revealing, more safe. And good writing is never that safe. Like no one's like, that was a really safe piece of writing and interesting. Like no one's like, you know, there's a little bit of there's that. And the other thing I do really, really critically is that if I can't find that voice, we're going to talk about what the voice is going to say in a second, but we're just going to talk about the voice for a second. If I can't find that voice, because sometimes, did you guys hear about some people don't have a voice in their head, it turns out. I have a very strong one, but I learned on the internet this year that some people go around their whole life without having a speaking voice in their head. Silence. Anyways, I end up speaking it aloud and then writing it as I speak so that I can really capture the natural sounds of what I need to say. Okay, so that's just some tips on getting started, because I think a lot of I think it's really intimidating for me at least, and I'm a writer, so I can imagine it, to have to write a story. It's such an intimidating process because for so many reasons, including our own self-understanding about what it means, the things that we've been taught about what a writing should do and how it should feel and what it should sound like. And I think it's very hard to step out of that and to write something that goes against all of that teaching. But it's the only way that you actually find a real voice. It's the only way you find that space. Does that make sense? Am I making sense? Okay. I'm gonna believe I'm making sense. And if I'm not, just, Brilliance. Okay. All right, good. I'm gonna go a few more minutes and talk about the actual, what we're looking for, and how to get it. And then I'm gonna sort of leave things open.
Leave a couple of minutes for questions because there's
Yes.
already 3 questions.
Yes, and I saw them and I'm like, I think I addressed that in one of so I'm in a good space. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about research and what to look for. So I'm going to take off my creative nonfiction writing hat for a second, and I'm going to put on my journalism research hat for a second. So a little bit of background. I spent a lot of my time living in like I said, I spent a lot of my time in communities of people who are not my community, not my natural organic community, right? Because I lived in the West Bank, Palestine. And then I lived in Cairo. I also spent 6 months in, in Chiapas, Mexico, working with the Zapatistas, with the Zapatista women. I lived in Quito, Ecuador for a year, working as a journalist there. And of course, I also spent time in the Sinai, which is Egypt, but it's controversial among the Bedouins. Living with the Bedouin villages in the Sinai. So I spent most of my adult life has not been in the States. Like, this is why this is weird for me. And it's been working in communities that are very much not my community. Like, my community is Southern African American, and the descendants of slaves. Like, that's my world, right? So a lot of my time has been like trying to figure out, not just in terms of how to tell a good story, but what is a good story and who has the right to tell it, and just who has the right to tell it, what do I have the right to tell, what don't I have the right to tell. Like, those ethical questions around writing is probably why it takes me so long to finish a piece, because I'm so concerned about telling it well and telling it responsibly, maybe is the way to put it. In a way, one of my tactics is I say, like, I have to write this in such a way that I assume that the people who I'm writing about can read this. Like, that they can read this and they can say yes. And that is a lot more pressure. A lot of journalists don't deal with. Good for them. So, okay. I'm just going to go through. So basically what I did was I wrote down a bunch of questions that probably in another universe I would have put on a worksheet or something. And maybe I still will if I get through today. Yesterday, by the way, was Thanksgiving here. So like, this world here is just sort of like, for those of you who aren't in the US, okay, we don't celebrate it. So it's like one of those days where you're like just waiting for it to end. Like, yay, genocide. It's a strange country I come from. Yeah, right. I cannot. I've had friends of mine. What is going? I don't know what's going on. Okay. All right. So first thing I just ask. Okay. So let's just say that I actually have figured out in some ways the sort of. I'm going to start with the idea that I have the visual first, right? That I have some idea of what the visual, for me, the visual is like what the photographs would look like. So I assume in some way that there's some kind of story that you want to tell, assuming. If not, this might be the wrong workshop for you, because, so the first thing I'm gonna ask is not just what is the story, what is the topic and what is the theme? Like, what are the more abstract concepts that are coming out of it? So it's one thing if I'm like, I spent the past 5 days at I'll take an example that I have a good example of. So I was at what's called an encuentro, like a meeting, a festival. I'm never quite sure how to describe the Zapatista moments that happen, where a bunch of Zapatistas from all the different comunidades come together in one place, and they hang out for a few days, and they talk, and they meet, and they organize, and so on and so forth. There's someone waiting. Okay, good. And I'm there as well. And so I know what the story is, which is that I want to talk about, is I want to show the Zapatista women and the ways that they did organizing and what it looked like. But what is the actual topic and the theme of the story? And I get a lot of that from talking to people. So for instance, is it feminism? Is it the ways in which like they are pushing against Western feminism and finding their own methods of like how they want to do organizing? What are they organizing around? Is this really about reclamation of culture? Do you see what I'm saying? Like I try to pull out what are the themes, the topics, the abstractions, so that I have some idea of what I'm working with. And then I want to know what is the history of the issue, which means I'm going to go back. First off, I'm going to talk to people. Second, I am a very awkward person. Please do not get that wrong. Anyone who's known, well, I guess Kate knows me in real life. I am not a people person. Not really, not in that extroverted way that people are. Do you know what I mean? That like they come and everyone feels comfortable around them. I'm not that chick. Like, so if you are, good for you, and please go forth and take my. So I had to find ways to do this while being weird. That's the only way I know how to put it. Sorry. And my way of doing it is that I learned to talk to people, and the first thing I normally ask them is about their families. Most people, it turns out, really like to talk about two things: their families and food. Everybody's got a story about their family. Everyone has a story about food. So, so those are the ways that I learned to get in. If you want to take those and use them, please do. It works because if you start asking people if I ask people about the larger history of the issue, you can't really get there for most people because it's too grandiose and abstract. But if you ask them about their own family history, like, oh, where'd your parents come from? Oh, where'd your grandparents come from? Oh, where is that? Oh, why did they come here? Like, oh, they used to live there. Like, then you start to tease out the personal stories that can connect into a larger political idea, right? So like, if I know that you used to live in this community and then you moved 300 miles to be in this community because like the weather was changing and you couldn't grow crops in this community any longer, I can connect that to a larger story around climate change, around the destruction of ecological territory, around the destruction of indigenous territory. Do you see what I'm saying? But like, it gives me a grounding into a personal story that lets me think about these larger concepts. Also, people just really love telling stories about the wild family people. Like they love it. The same and the same thing goes in. So what I'm trying to say is that when I'm listening to people tell their individual stories, in the back of my head, I'm always trying to connect it to these other larger questions. Also, just for a hint, if you can get away with it, try using a recording device with permission, obviously. That's what I mean by get away with it. Like if you can get permission because it's very difficult to remember people's stories while they're telling them to you, especially if you're photographing them at the same time. Like it's just a lot of mental power that you're going through. So if you can just put a recorder or your phone and press record, you'll have a secondary instrument to help you take notes later on. We're asking about also, the other story that you can find out is if people don't want to talk a lot. I guess a lot of my talk is about how to make people talk to you. What is the story of the objects around them? A lot of people don't want to tell personal stories, but they want to tell you stories about like the things that are significant. So anything at this point, if it looks interesting or older, or like I've asked people about where their pots and pans have come from, you know what I mean? Like all sorts of things. And people will usually start opening up that way because it's not about them. It's like, it's a little bit off of them, right? If they have goats, you can ask them like, and I've spent a lot of time around goats. I don't know why that's I have chickens in my backyard. So if y'all want to ask me about the chickens in my backyard, I do. We get eggs. I really do live in rural Minnesota right now, y'all. This is not a joke. So I asked a story about the objects that they have. I asked about the history of the place. Like for instance, if you're in a place and I want to know, so what does the name of the place mean? That often will open up a story as well, you know? So I'm trying to find ways to get stories without making it seem too personal on them. because, and part of the reason I'm doing this is because when you're writing, you want to be able to have these very rich quotes, these sort of like, you know what I mean? And usually you can get, the best way to get them is someone just tells you a story, and as they're telling you, they sort of say something that's interesting. They tell another kind of story that leads you somewhere else, that you can go down a rabbit hole with it. Before I go, this is me, not everyone does this. I like to know as much as I can before I go into the situation. So I do my research beforehand. I do research on the people, I do research on the culture, I, you know, look at pictures, I get the history down, I get the place names down, I make sure that I make sure my pronunciation is correct for the specific items that I want to work with. And that's just a way to gain trust as well. But also for me, I'm just a preparer. Like, I want to go into something knowing as much as I can. There are plenty of people who will fly by the seat of their pants. They get all the information and they run back to their house and then they do all the research. It seems to work for them. It's fine. It just isn't my cup of tea. I am not that spontaneous. The other question I ask is, who is the audience for the story? This is really, really critical. The way that you tell the story changes by who you know is your primary audience. I'm gonna stop here for a second. In a few more minutes, I'm gonna go really quick. I'm gonna talk about that for a second. But the audience is super important because you need to make an ethical choice, so I wanted to say this. When I say who is the audience for the story, I don't mean who are the majority of people who will read it. Because if I did that, all of my stories, and I mean this with all due respect, would be for like white Americans, right? Because that's the people who are gonna read. I mean, that's how numbers work. If you want to sell a decent book, the majority of people who buy it are probably gonna have to be from the majority. But I always tell my stories saying that the primary audience, and the way I write those stories is for the people who I'm writing about. It gives me an ethical stance, grounding. That's what I'm looking for. It gives me a grounding, and it means that I tell the story in a way that says that I'm not going, you know what I mean? That's my primary audience. And then secondary is the people who actually buy the book. That's how I do it. But I think it's this question you have to ask yourself. Why is your story important or interesting? I know it sounds like, but you really need to get that why in there. Why are you telling the story? Why is it important? Why is it interesting? Who is it important to? Who is it interesting to? Because that stops you from exoticizing the story. It stops you from thinking, and that's the same thing with thinking about the audience. Like, just showing something or telling something because, ooh, it sounds really like fancy or like exotic or different to, let's say, like, I don't know, white Europeans, may not be the thing you actually want to put in there. It could be incredibly insulting to the people you're talking about, right? So you have to think about that, because you have to assume that they too are going to see the same thing. Okay, hi, yes.
Yeah, I was mute. I just wanted to ask to say again, because at one point you started like talking very fast. So if you can
sorry. Thank you.
Say again the last part, it would be great.
Okay, so, yeah.
What I understood is that the last thing I understood was that you write stories for people, for the people you are talking about. And then I lost.
Okay, yeah, that's totally, thank you for reminding me. The coffee is very strong this morning. So what I was saying is so for instance, I wrote this book, but I wrote it about my time in Palestine and my time in Mexico and my time in Egypt primarily. And when I wrote it assuming that the people I was writing about would be reading it, all right? Secondary to that is everybody else. Hold on, let me go through it. So what I'm saying is, that's the question about the audience. The question is, what does the audience need to know? And then I was saying, what makes the story interesting or important? Like, why are you telling the story? Because that's critical to how you write the story. And then I was saying that a lot of times, especially because especially if you're writing a story outside of your own, like about cultures or about peoples who aren't you, people want to choose I'll give an example. Vice. Vice does this like it's nobody's business. I have issues with Vice, and I won't go through my story about Vice, but it's funny. But Vice does this thing where it exoticizes and finds the like creepy, exotic, different thing in every story and sort of like presents it to its predominantly white Western audience, like, ooh, look at this weird culture and the weird.
I know what you.
Yeah. I think we all have seen at least one Vice story in our lifetimes, one too many. I used to know the editors. I can say that they are douchebags. I'm not sure if you understand that particular English phrase, but trust me. Anyways, going on. When is the story? The season, year, what time is it happening? This really, because that gives you texture to be able to say when is it happening. It also helps to look at photographs and know when is this. Last things I'll talk about are the story. Okay, you also want to think about, you don't have to include all of these things, but they're like areas to think about how to get into the work. So how did you find the story? Why did you find it interesting? And what is the story of how you got to the place and documented the story? Sometimes it does help to be able to talk about what did you do to have to travel, checkpoints, transportation, how did you know about the story, about the place? Sometimes that personal context makes a lot of sense. Sometimes it doesn't. And lastly, what did you learn from doing the story? How did it transform you? How do you see things differently? I am someone who clearly cares about the personal inside of the political. It's kind of my bag. It's my thing. So, and when we read things, we often are reading, when we see art in general, what we want to know about the person who created it. In part for a political reason, we want to understand. I want to know when I see a photograph, let's say one more photograph of the Serengeti, who was it that took that picture? Because I want to know what's the context in which I'm looking at this. Am I looking at someone who's from the place, or am I looking at someone who flew into it? That changes for me what I'm looking at. It also changes what the photograph is going to look like and why it looks the way it does. So I need to know it for that. But also I want to know how, if you're a photographer, how did getting this story change you or transform you? Because I don't know, we're people and we want to feel like we're people in the world and other people are also there too. Anyways, last thing I'll say before, and I'll get the questions real quick. So please keep putting them in. I'm sorry, I know. Make sure you get the correct spelling for names. Just as an editor, please, dear God, please get the right spelling for names. Do not. Especially if you know that how it needs to be spelled, especially if it is not a Western alphabet name. I worked in the Middle East for a very long time. There are standards for this, y'all. First thing, ask the person themselves. And if they don't have a name, then look at like what international translations will give you. Don't just make it up yourself. And look at and ask about the ways, and make sure you get down the ways of the people, where they're from, get those names correct. We're getting into editor mode, and the ways in which they identify, race, gender, religion, family, clans. Don't assume, ask. And I say that very seriously because I have seen way too many reports. Well, first off, I've seen way too many reports. I won't even talk about gender and pronouns, which is another thing, but people get ethnicity and clans and families wrong all the time. And it causes issues with the people you interviewed who now look like they belong to a different family. It's not a good look. You've not helped the situation. Won't go into those stories, but trust me. Okay. So I think I made it quickly, hopefully not too quickly through it all.
Mai'a, is there any chance that you could somehow structurize those notes into like bullet points and share that?
Yes, I can. I will. I looked at this and I was like, this is decent. Last night I was on a rush and I was like, I have all the answers that I ever wanted to tell you somebody.
Nice.
Okay, let's do some really quick questions. How do you as a writer make sure those multiple perspectives are seen by the masses and not just by people who already have a vested interest in or connection to the subject? Does that even matter anymore? This is a really great question. This is excellent. Okay, so I have half an answer for you, not a full one. The internet is the first part of that answer, which is that, thank goodness, there has been a certain democratization of information, especially over the past, let's call it 15 years, of really being able to push perspectives forward. I mean, at first thing I want you to think, when you ask the question, I kind of want to differentiate who are the masses. And I want to get much more specific about who exactly are the populations you want to see this message, and then tailor it that way. It takes a little bit more work because there is no masses any longer. Like, I don't know. For instance, I live in a very conservative part of the US. So how I tell a story when I'm here is very different than how I tell a story when I'm in Minneapolis, which is really different than how I tell a story when I'm in Berlin. Very different audiences, very different stories. So you have to think specifically about who is it that you're wanting to talk to and why. And it's, I mean, yeah, I live in the world of the open question. Anyways, so that's where I would put it. And as to how, well, once you know who, the how becomes just a pat, like, who do they also read? Where do they also get their information? And that can be anything from like newspapers and obviously like more traditional publications to Facebook groups to everything in between, right?
So does that mean you'll change your language?
Yes, very much so. Oh God, have to.
So like when you're writing for Al Jazeera, obviously you're writing in this very dry sort of
right.
Speak.
Yes. Yeah. When I write for like big paper, I mean, when I edited, so for instance, I worked for Al Jazeera, but then I worked for a smaller social justice magazine. Very different writing styles. And another way to do that is to read what is being written and understand what is being, do you know what I'm saying? Like if you read Al Jazeera for a couple of weeks, you will know what the sound, what they're looking for. In the same way, when I was a magazine editor, I would tell people when they would pitch me stories, I'd say, read what we've written and then repitch it to me looking at how we write things, because it's just different. That's why I have so many different questions. Yes.
But so to follow up on that, but the details that you gather in terms of questions and information and the texture, as you were saying, and all of that, that remains the same. That's still groundwork that always needs to be done, and then just
right
differently, right?
Yes. So for instance, I'll give an example. For Al Jazeera, you're always going to start, for anything, Al Jazeera, anything that's like a legacy institution, you're going to start with the facts, you know, like who, what, where, when, why, how. That's what the story is, because you're doing journalism and news stories. If it's a little bit more essay-like, you'll start with an interesting lead in. It's the catch in to get the writer, the most read it.
Can I give an example? So in journalism school, they teach us there is the pyramid, so the detail, and then you broaden out, and the reverse pyramid, which is the opposite, the who, what, where, when, what, why, and then leading down to the final detail. So think of writing that way. You can start with like broad information or with like super niche and then broaden out.
Right, because the difference is if you think of it as a reader, and I advise people, the only thing I should have put here is read, because if you read, you'll see it. Why did I click on that article? Why did I keep reading that article? What was it in the first paragraph that made me not click off when I can read anything on the internet? What made me stay here? And then put that into your writing. You know what I mean? Like think of like that's, I mean, when I taught writing, my students would complain how much I gave them to read, but it's because it's such a broad idea. If you're writing, when I was a magazine editor, and so I got a lot of creative nonfiction, mostly what I got, I would tell them, you have to make it personal. You have to give me a personal story to hang on, either yours or someone else's. Start with a conversation that you had, start with a detail, a story, something that catches me, because our readers, they want to feel something at the end of it, right? And so you can put in all the facts and figures, but you have to start with the heart, basically, which I'm not like a big heart person. So please, but if you are, have I got okay.
I have another question. Do you prefer like the more news like articles or the more sort of your voice articles? And which ones do you think are more impactful?
I think that there's a lot of different kinds of people in the world. So for me, okay, for writing, if I'm writing for money, I prefer to write news. It's quicker, it's more efficient.
Right.
It's a formula that you just snap through. And if I'm editing, I'd rather edit for news, because again, I'm just, I used to write so much in news. At the end of the day, people would ask me, what did you write about? And I would be like, I don't know.
I know that feeling.
I have no idea what I just spent 8 hours writing about global news, and I have no idea what most of it was, but I was good at it. But when I'm reading, I love to read a good story that puts me someplace I haven't been. Right? Like that's how I fall asleep at night. So yeah. And most of my books on my shelf are creative nonfiction. So it's sort of, but if I have to write it, it's not a good way to make money, because it takes me too long to write it for the money that's available. Like $400 is nothing when you spent that kind of time. All right, I'm gonna go really just get to the question. How do you approach an editor, publisher to propose this kind of stories? What is your experience being published? And I'm asking, okay. Moving from self-publishing into having someone else publish you. I can talk about this very quickly, but I feel like this is a whole different workshop, which could be done at a different time. I could talk about publishing a lot, because I have so the best thing to do, as I said, is to read. Whoever you're trying, if you don't like reading the stuff that's in that magazine or newspaper or then don't send work there. No matter how prestigious you think the place is, if you don't like reading it, you won't write it well. You just won't. As for pitches, okay, as for and to pitch to people, just really quickly, you want to pitch. Most places that are decent will tell you on their website how to pitch and what they want to see in a pitch. Look at the submission guidelines, follow them to the T. No editor wants to get your creative version of their submission guidelines. Like, just do it. Put in what you want to put in. You want to, when you pitch, you especially want to make it clear that you have read that magazine or that publication. You want to say how your article fits into their schema. Talk about other articles in which it could build off of, or make it clear that they haven't covered the issue before, and make it clear that it falls directly into their niche, right? I'm speaking as an editor now. You want to also make sure that you provide enough personal information that you prove that you are the person who can write this story. Because if not, and you want to make sure that you please include clips. Clips are examples of your writing that feel similar to the magazine or publication that you're sending it to. Basically, it's like, you know what it's like? It's like dating, right? Like you're trying to make a match. So you want to show that you and this other magazine have a lot in common, and that you could really work well together. And so you're trying to make that argument to the magazine quickly. Please just make it a couple of paragraphs. No editor has time to read your life story. I'm sorry, that sounds cruel, but it's true. And so, okay, that's my basics on publishing and pitching. That's like the if you wanted to ask me more, I can tell you more like off screen, but like, and I can show you.
If you're happy, I could like email you and ask you a few questions, because honestly, I could stay here listening to you like for the whole evening, but I understand it's not actually possible. So if you're happy, I could send you an email.
Yeah, I put my email in the chat.
Send it to me, but I'll put it in the general chat.
Oh, okay. Okay, sorry. So yeah, that's how. So that's. I mean, thinking about publishers is, yeah. I can show you. We can move through that world a little bit more. Okay.
There's one more question from Elinatu. She said, "Why did you go to many countries? Did you want to know about their lives?"
Yeah. That was a quick intro. Okay. So yes, the short answer to the question is yes. That's why. The long answer to the question is because I started off by going to Palestine during the second Intifada. And the reason I did that is because I was incredibly interested in the Israeli-Palestine conflict. I was reading about it in the newspapers and so on and so forth. And especially in US media, it feels very chaotic. Like you can't get a clear vision of it because we are super pro-Israel, but and so I just went for a few days to find out for myself what it was. I just like to have, and then I fell in love with Palestine, and then I just like found an organization who would basically sponsor me to be there. That's how I started. And then I started working in journalism. And once you're like working in journalism for a while, all the people you know also work in it. So you start with, does that make sense? Like, so then, but yeah, it was pretty much, also I was 23 when I went. And when you're 23, your prefrontal cortex hasn't fully come into play necessarily, and you can make spontaneous decisions without having why else would you go to a war zone when you're 23 years old with no skills? So that's why I just really fell in love with Palestine, and I fell in love with the Middle East, and I fell in love with and I felt like as a US citizen especially, I felt it was 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005. The Iraq War was in full thrall. 9/11 had just happened. And it felt like the Middle East was a place where I could make some balance, you know, and be able to bring back a perspective that wasn't US corporate media heavy, so that people could have a different idea of what their government, what the US was paying for. You know, we do pay for the occupation in Palestine. We are still in Iraq. Afghanistan is a US imperial policy is interesting. So but that's why, and that's how I kind of got started. And then I just became really, really interested in working with like women, especially mothers in those regions. They're amazing. They just kill it every day. And that became my passion. That's where we are now. Okay. Yeah. Any other questions?
Any other questions? The silent ones in the back there.
Sorry again. I've got the last question, if you don't mind. And the last question is, you mentioned you photograph people as well as interviewing them. And since I did something like that to produce one of my works, I would like to ask approach, or what kind of, I don't know, communication technique, or how do you behave with them? Like, because I remember that I decided to not to get my camera off my bag until they were comfortable enough to, you know, open themselves and speak about even vulnerable topics, right? So how did you approach all this process?
That
I know
is
maybe it's a
really
bit harder.
yeah. No, it's a really good question. And it basically is about building trust with the people who you're around. And that is with or without a camera. Like you, so that's why I started off by saying, I started off asking about their families. Like I start off in conversation. And I think, I mean, in some ways, so I agree, like pulling out of cameras can be really intimidating. Pulling out like back in the day, I'd have like a notebook and a pen, you know, that if there's something very cold about it. And so I tried to find, as I said, also, I'm a very awkward person. I am not. My brother's like the one who can make anyone talk. And I'm like, I can't even make myself talk. So one of those ways is, especially when I was working, because I started off working in Palestine where there were a lot of house demolitions. So you would just show up at someone's house and like, it's the worst day of their life. Like, hi, it's the worst day of your life. Israel just crashed your house and you no longer have a place to live or anything, you know? And, you know, let's take some pictures. Like it's just a weird scenario to enter into and to be emotionally present. So here are the ways in which I would say I did it. One, I am willing to spend a lot of time. I spend a lot, hours and hours, and I've drank a lot of tea, a lot of really sugary tea with people. And I have asked them about, and that's why I learned also to be said, like as a woman, most of the time I would get shunted into the women's space, which is how I learned how to ask about food. Because if you start with food, you can kind of start to move questions a little bit closer and a little bit closer. So, you know, and people and also asking people to teach me something. Teach me how to make this, right? Teach me how to like make this family recipe thing, like sit down. Because I also learned a good amount of Palestinian and Egyptian cuisine because I don't cook, but like, because I had to sit down and learn how to like make grape leaves, like the rolled grape leaves. And then as you're doing it, and as you're sort of doing it, then you can kind of like start leaning into the question or be like, start saying, oh, can I take a picture of the food first? Can I take a picture of this object first? Can I like ease towards your face? It sounds creepy if I say it that way. But that's what I'm trying. So I'm slowly, so like so that's what I've learned. And I think I learned that because my grandmother is the same way. She's not someone who would tell me straight out this horrible story about living in apartheid South in the 1930s, you know? But if I started off asking her about how she made the cake, we'd kind of get there in 30 minutes. So that's my way of doing it. But then, yeah. And I obviously do not spit out the food, swallow. Just eat it.
Whatever it is.
I have eaten rabbit, y'all. It is. Yeah, it was.
For some, that would be very normal.
Yes, exactly. And it was alive when I got at the house. It was on my plate by the end of the day. I ate that rabbit. So
wow.
Did you pat it? Did you get to pat the rabbit?
Said, wow.
Yeah, I got my background information and I got my photos, okay, of that rabbit.
Rocio, there's still another question. Is everyone okay to stay for a few more minutes? Maya,
I can stay. I have to leave in 25 minutes.
Okay, cool.
I'm good.
So first from Chiara, would you go back to something that you wrote and rewrite it again or read it with a different eye?
All the time. Like, honestly, even reading the work I just read to you that I wrote that was published 2 years ago is almost painful.
Yeah. Would you feel the same way about photographs?
Yes.
Okay. Interesting.
When I think about it now, I think of how I could have done it differently, but that's my brain. Like my brain's, I have an editor's brain for a reason because it edits my stuff first. So I'm never more cruel to anyone else than I am to my own work. Don't worry about it. So I actually have to make a rule with myself that goes, once that thing is published, take it off the table. You don't get if I read it out loud, I'll change it up a little bit because the voice changes. I would change how I took photographs, definitely. I can't, because normally I'm not back in that, it's a specific time, a specific place, a specific moment. But yeah, I advise that if you have a story and you read it 3 years later and you think I can write that better, go back through it. There is nothing sacred. They are just words. Let it go. Who you were 3 years ago may have been from a very different perspective, a very different emotional place, a very different intellectual place than you are now. Make it better. There are some of my favorite writers have republished their same books every 10 years. Mm-hmm. And they're just better work. So yeah. The other caveat to that is that you have to let it go sooner or later, which is why I like publishing, because it makes me let it go. And then you have to accept that you cannot change the past. That's just a larger, probably philosophical issue about human existence, but it's also true with writing. Like it's okay if it's not the best thing you could do right now, because it's a snapshot in a time that shows where you were. And if you're going to have a career or a legacy, people are going to want to see your growth, right? Like I read Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison, is this a reference we get? I read some writers' work from like the 70s, and I read what they wrote a couple of years ago. And you can, it's fun to see them become better writers over time. Okay, so there's that. Anything?
Yeah, Ross, your microphone is muted.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I'm really fascinated by your talk. Thank you so much. I've been like taking lots of notes. And one of the things that you talk about, like, when you go and approach and talk and do, photograph food and talk about food and all that, it really made me think that it felt like it's because it seems that it's a more natural way of approaching people and provide that connection and that trust. And it just gonna make me think, recently I listened to an elder in Canada. We have these indigenous elders that provide wisdom. And one of the things that this lady was telling us about is like approaching a project, a community project, not from the standpoint of a mosquito, of a colonizer, which is like you go, you take what you need, and then you're out. And so it really kind of made me think about how I approach my stories and the stories that I want to tell. And I'm trying to resolve, and I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, in like how we can make sure that we have our checks and balances in place. So we are given, we're not from a taking perspective, but that there is a give and take relationship. Any perhaps further thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. This is basically my ethical struggle, because there's a long, let me start from the beginning. I said when I started that my grandparents come from the South, as it's known. Both of them like Jim Crow South, like apartheid South, like hardcore South, like KKK South. And so, I feel very so I think of it that way. I think about how protective I feel about my own family and my own family history and the land that we grew up on. We're also indigenous. We come from Lumbee people to that land as well. And so I'm so protective over them that I try to remember that everybody else is just as protective over their people, their family, their stories, their trauma, their tragedy, their pictures, their image as well, right? Like, no, everyone loves their family just as much as I love mine. Probably more than I love mine, because let's be honest. So I had to think about, true story, I had friends of mine, white Northern friends, who would want to come and see, like, oh my God, you come, because there's something a little exotic about where my family comes from. It's rare to come from like rural South, deep South territory. And I'd be like, yeah, you're not coming. Because I felt like it was, so I had to think about to myself, how would I want someone to enter into my community? Right? And the way I want them to do so, and what does respect feel like? Even if they're getting a story out of it, Are they bringing in more than what they take? And that's my aim, which is why I think it takes me a long time to write a story, is I aim to give more than I took. I don't necessarily accomplish it, but bye, Kiara. Is that how I spell? One of those ways, so I'm gonna talk about a few of those ways that I enter into community, and then we can talk. Have you tried money? Because money is great. I realize it is not, like, here's the thing. I think that we have weird values around money, but a lot of times I found out that people honestly need money and you have it. And I'm not talking about paying for stories necessarily. I'm really, really not. But I am talking about acknowledging that oftentimes at the places where we go are in circumstances in which people are dealing with their basic survival needs. And it seems somewhat unfair that I'm fully able to travel to this place and have all my needs provided for, to make a story about someone who does not necessarily have all that, and they leave with less than what they had when they came. So I just want to put money out there because it took me a long time to get used to that idea. And now I feel much more at ease with it. But like, just put it in your head. The other thing that I really struggle with is I really try to, I share the pictures that I took with those communities. I share the stories that I wrote with those communities as much as I'm able to. And I try to, and when I think about writing a story, I think about writing it with the community, with the family, with the person, versus writing it about them. So that's why it takes me a long time, because I'm trying to like figure out what do they get from me telling this story? Like, what do they get from these photographs? Sometimes it means I take a bunch of others, like I take a bunch of other photographs that have nothing to do with what I need, but so I can send it to them so that they have what they need. I mean, everything, family pictures, getting dressed up with your family and like posing in like, you know, whatever you have available. I used to do a lot of, I used to be a really good sketch artist. And so I would sit there and like sketch the children and sketch the dogs or whatever, just to like give them something else. A lot of communities are gift communities. So like, I was working, I'm sorry, I just realized I was working in the Congo. I worked in the DRC for a bit as well. And I was working in the DRC, and I remember I was working very like under violence because of the war. I remember a woman knocked on my door one day and she handed me 20 eggs. And I had no kitchen. I had no idea what to do with these eggs. Like, they're just eggs, you know, because it's a gift giving culture. So now I have 20 eggs. And so I had to like, so then of course, the next village I went to, I was like, do y'all want eggs? Because I have a lot of eggs, like, and no one to eat them. So that also is important. I also, a lot of times before I go to a place, I ask people, what do they need? And I bring it, you know, like a lot of my bag is filled with things that I myself am just going to give out to various communities as it's necessary. Yeah, so that's sort of that's part of it. The other thing on a more like, so that's a materialistic level. On a philosophical level, like I said, another thing I do is I write in a language which means that people who speak English as their second language can read it, which is not the most academic or intellectual language. That's on purpose. I can code switch if you need me to. I can get up there in the academic register. But my baseline is to say, could I read this if it was translated into Spanish? Because Spanish is my strongest second language. So so that's where I kind of, that's another way so the work is accessible, not just to the communities that I wrote about, but to communities who are like that community. And I think about, and for instance, the book I wrote, this one here, I called it like, this is a love letter to the communities that I lived in and to the women who I worked with, who taught me a lot. And I tried to write it as a love letter to say thank you, you know? and to acknowledge that probably in the end, I still took more than what I gave. Yeah, a little bit of humility, maybe a lot of humility.